Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's In the Know podcast, where I'm delighted to be joined by the one and only Gillian Hepburn, Commercial Director of Benchmark. Welcome, Gillian. Good to see you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem. I think the last time we spoke, we were talking about artificial intelligence
All right, yeah.
and whether it would terminate financial planning, but it looks like we're still here. So it hasn't
We're
happened
also
yet,
here.
but
Absolutely not. And I
I'm
don't
sure
think
we'll
it
get
will
into that.
actually. Yeah, we will.
Oh, really? Okay, right. Well, I'll hold you to that. We'll have a bit more of a conversation.
Sure.
The reason I wanted you to come on the podcast is because you recently launched the advisor survey, which I had a copy of, read. It was in the paper as well, and there's some interesting trends. So, as this podcast is called In the Know, then ideally I want somebody in the know to tell me what's going on. But before we dive into that, I just want to find out a bit more about you, Gillian, because I've spoken a number of times, and every guest that I've had on the podcast, I tend to ask them how they sort of ended up in financial services. And so far, it's all by accident. No one's really wanted to come into it. So how did you get into financial services? Was it by design? Was it by accident?
No, it was by accident. But actually, it's a really good point, isn't it? Why do people not come in by design, And I think that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, no, sadly, I was by accident. I was doing an English degree at University at Aberdeen. Thought I was going to be a teacher. I spent a week back in my old school and decided after that wasn't really for me. And my neighbour at the time, fortunately, was in Standard Life in HR. And I said, are there any summer jobs? Because I might need to change my plans on a career. He said, I can't guarantee it, but I'll put your CV to the top of the pile, so they'll speak to you. So I did 2 summers as a temp in Standard Life, literally stamping mail, filing, photocopying. It was many years ago. And thought, this isn't actually as bad as I thought it might be. I always had this thing about I don't want to work in an office, but actually it wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be like. There was lots of young people and it was great fun as well. And they then launched a graduate scheme. And that was the first year when I graduated. It was the first year that Standard Life had a scheme, which was not just for actuaries. And I joined that. Yeah, interesting. I joined the scheme. And again, interesting, they decided to start small. There was 4 of us, all women, which again, interesting if you think back to the late 80s. And that's really how I got into the industry, and I spent 2 years doing the rounds into various departments, and then my career moved in a number of different directions after that. But that's literally how I got into the industry.
Excellent. Was it when your career moved around? Was it planned at all? Or was it just a case of opportunities just presented themselves and you work your way?
A great question, James, because a lot of it was just opportunities, and people often say to me, what they ask me about advice and stuff in terms of the industry, and I think one of the key things now is careers don't always go in straight lines, right? So it's not about staying in the same place and just trying to get a more senior position. I just took every opportunity that came in my direction, which is why I ended up working for a number of years in customer service division, and laterally they are managing some large departments. I did some IT work when they were bringing in, what was cutting edge technology in terms of image and workflow. I then, spent some time in marketing. And then I ended up in distribution, where the last role I had was launching their platform to the UK market. And then I was BDM for a number of years. So for me, it was just about taking every opportunity that came in my direction. And because you never know how they're going to end up. And it just gave me a really broad spread of knowledge and experience.
Yeah, you've experienced the ecosystem of financial services in different parts.
I have indeed. And then obviously I moved after that. I always thought, to be fair, I'd do my 40 years, get my nice 2/3 final salary, and that would be me done. But I got an opportunity to leave the business. I wasn't particularly unhappy, but I left the business to work for a small discretionary fund manager. It was probably too big a change from a large corporate to a very small business. And then I consulted for a number of years across the industry, working with advisors, asset managers, literally, to be fair, doing anything that anybody would pay me for. And that's where I really learned a lot about the industry and made a huge number of contacts and built a network. And then I built an online business and sold that into Embark at the time, moved with it. And then a few years later, Schroders came knocking on the door. So I've been really, fortunate, but I think part of it is at times being brave enough to do things, so giving up a job and sticking a CV out and saying I am now a consultant was, if I look back, it was quite a brave thing to do at that point. But it was a really interesting time in my life as well.
It's a ballsy move, I have to say.
It was.
Oh, credit to
And
you.
you know what? You learn loads. Other than the biggest lesson was you spend an awful lot of time with your accountant and all sorts of things rather than actually doing what you love. And there's this whole feast and famine piece about cash flow and managing a business and learning about how all of that works. And I think often that's why I do have an affinity with a lot of advisor businesses, because a number of them are still relatively small businesses. I know cash flow is king, isn't it? You're always balancing the books, and I think having launched a business, well, two businesses actually, you really learn what it's like to be a small business owner. Yeah, and it's not easy.
No, it's not. Thank you. I know.
You know,
It's incredibly difficult, but it's also thoroughly rewarding.
Yes, but particularly as well. I mean, I didn't ever move to the point of taking on staff, but that's quite a worry as well. You are effectively responsible for making sure that other people can pay their mortgages. And
Yes.
and that's that can be really stressful.
Do you think that affinity of or experience of running a small business allows you to be, I guess, a little bit more authentic with advisors because you've been there, how
Absolutely.
it works, you get it.
Yeah,
You're not just from a big company. You experience the highs and lows and the issues that are contained within
totally. that. And also, absolutely. And also one of the learns, particularly when you're consulting, is I think what you forget is you're actually selling yourself all the time. That's what you're doing projects for advisors as I was. I was doing a lot of work, for example, in terms of platform due diligence and centralized investment propositions. But essentially, you've got to keep yourself out in the market. You're always trying to find new clients whilst you're servicing your existing clients. Yeah. And that's very much what advisors have to do. So yeah, I do think that helped me really understand, some of the challenges that they face.
Okay. And now Benchmark, you're with Benchmark Commercial Director.
Yeah.
Just tell me a bit more about Benchmark, what they offer.
So I joined Schroders 5 years ago, and I moved that was to launch our investment solutions business, and then I moved onto the board about 2.5 years ago, onto the Benchmark board. So I haven't moved across that business kind of blind, if that makes sense. So Benchmark is essentially the financial planning business within Schroders, and that's not to confuse it with Schroders Personal Wealth, which is a joint venture with Lloyds Banking Group. So Benchmark was fully acquired, I think, back in 2021. We have a network of advisors. We have an advice business, and the advice business is nationally based. They're actually one of the appointed reps of the network. We also have our own platform, and then we use the investment solutions from Schroders. Although the platform and the network is independent, the platform is whole of market. So kind of a broad business actually, and right in the sweet spot, I think, particularly in terms of some of the services that we offer, and also many advisors, as you know, James, are looking for exit strategies and plans, and we do acquire businesses. Interestingly, many of them will join the network first. They'll learn a bit more about us as a business. We're also seeing people joining networks for all sorts of reasons at the moment. Compliance, and we can come on to that in terms of the advisor survey. But so many of them come through the network. They work with us. They learn to understand how we operate as a business, and actually about our culture as well. And many of them will have a longer term aspiration to be acquired. And once they go through that process, they will end up in the Benchmark financial planning business.
Okay, so there's a whole range of services being offered then.
Absolutely.
And it's working with the advisor community.
It totally is. And, one of the things that's really important to me is that overall proposition. So what do advisors need and want from us? In terms of things like, mortgage and protection panels, for example. And again, we'll come on to talk about AI, but, what can we be delivering to make their businesses more efficient and then more valuable?
Yeah. Okay. So with regards to the advisor needs and wants, obviously the one thing that you've done recently is the report.
Absolutely.
which I read with interest. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, when you were compiling it, did it sort of match the mood music that you were hearing anyway, in terms of the results that you saw and actually what you're seeing in terms
Yeah.
of, when you're on the ground, as it were? Did it sort of match your expectations?
Yeah, a really good question, because we run the survey every year, and then in COVID we launched what we called a pulse survey to take the temperature check. How are advisors feeling in lockdown? Not being able to engage face to face with people, was it hard to find new clients? All of that stuff. So the advisor survey, the main survey, so the one that we're talking about, runs every November. And this year will actually be the 10th year, so we've got a lot of data going back. And for me, it's always about two things. It's often about just confirming what you thought anyway. So back to that question, how much of it is just confirmation that we know enough about the market, we've got our finger on the pulse, and we absolutely understand some of the problems and challenges of advisors. And then sometimes you'll get what I often call the kind of aha moments, that, oh, that's not what I expected. And that's equally as, well, sometimes you could argue more interesting, isn't it? But in the main, yes, it probably reflects. If we're close enough to our clients, then it actually should reflect what they're thinking and what they're saying to us. But I think what's useful in terms of the survey is it quantifies it for us.
Yeah.
We knew. I mean, we can dive into it, but a great example is the questions about cash as against long-term investing. People are sitting there looking at fixed 1-year cash rates of in excess of 5.5%, 6%. So why would I put money into risk assets? Why would I put money in the market when I can get this? And we spent a lot of time last year. We knew these conversations were happening, but the fact that 95% of advisors told us that we are having these kind of conversations with clients. What we did last year is a lot of work in terms of helping advisors to have the conversations with their clients about the benefits of long-term investing, as opposed to taking that short-term view on the cash rates. So for us, it delivers us a lot of intelligence, but it also then helps us think about how we can support advisors. So for me, we knew it was happening, but getting the numbers was really helpful, because maybe we did realise the scale, but I always think, if you can quantify it, it's just far more important.
Yeah, it helps. It sets the tone and allows you to plan
Absolutely.
as well, and to give,
Of course it does. Yeah.
help and support the advisors
And
when they
that's
need it.
key for us, and it's interesting, because when I joined 5 years ago, I was told, one of my first roles, as you know, I do a lot of work with the press, for example, and speak at conferences, and I was told, here's the advisor survey, it's all been completed, and you need to do we usually do a launch, so maybe a breakfast or a dinner. And I looked at it and I thought, well, it's interesting, but some of the questions aren't hugely relevant in my opinion. So we were asking things like, what risk profiling tool do you use? Now, I could have probably made an educated guess on what they were and roughly in what order, but is that really telling us something? I don't mean, yes, of course it's important what tool they're using, but for me there were other more interesting things that we should have been asking. And quite frankly, if you're using the survey also in terms of some of our PR activity, that doesn't give you a headline that X amount of advisors are using Y risk tool. There's plenty other surveys out there that do that kind of detailed research, particularly when they're focusing, for example, on technology. So we spent quite a bit of time just reshaping some of that and looking at what are the questions that give us significant trends that we absolutely don't want to lose, and we run those questions year on year. And then we spend a lot of time every time we do the survey saying what's happening in the market, and what do we want to find out more about. I mean, clearly things like the consumer duty questions started to go in last year. So it's always a case of taking some questions out that don't feel so relevant and then putting new ones in. Because one of the things for me is we can't make the survey too long, because people won't answer it, or they'll get bored halfway through and they'll just tick the boxes. We all behave like that. So it's about keeping it tight and keeping it kind of relevant, and making sure therefore that advisors want to give us information, but it's not taking hours of their time and massive amounts of detail.
Yeah, because you get reader fatigue and they won't complete it.
Absolutely. And the other thing people say is, can you give us lots of detail about the advisors that complete it? I'm like, do you know what? I can't, because these advisors don't necessarily use Schroders in any way, shape, or form. They are on our database, so at some point we've engaged with them. But it doesn't mean to say they're active holders of Schroder funds or that they work with us through Benchmark, using one of our many services. It's a broad reach across the market. And we don't ask them lots of details about their business and who they are, because the last thing I want is an advisor thinking that I'm just going to use this as a marketing tool. It's absolutely not. We're not going to start to send them lots of information about various products. That's not the purpose of it. So I'm really, every year people say, why don't you ask more about their businesses? We've got other ways of engaging with advisors on the detail. So it's about, it's just answer the questions and help us out.
Yeah, we do an advisor survey on salary and benefits every year. So this is in its 12th year. We're just doing the question. The questionnaire has just been issued. We get between 5 to 650 people completing it, and it gives us a broad data range. But it's the most downloaded insight report that we do, because people are interested in terms of benchmarking.
Absolutely.
But the strength of the questions really does. It helps the responses that you get. And I think over the years, we keep refining, because we want it to be a really useful and data-led, not just giving wide bandings, but what's it like in the Northeast compared to the Southeast? What do advisors feel about the economy, the political state? We try and get a real sense of what's happening. So we've been doing it for 12 years, and as I say, it's one of the most interesting pieces of research that we do, which advisors and firms like. So, but the strength of the questions are so important.
The questions are really important, but also it's how we want them to answer. So if we're doing multiple choice questions, how do we create the responses that give us sensible data? So we do spend, I work out backwards from when do we want to announce this to the press, working back in terms of at what point do we need to have the questions, when does the survey, you'll be the same, when does it go out, what does it look like? But it's interesting. There's probably a lot more work and thought going into it than people would imagine, and you'll probably agree with that one.
Because does it match? Do the trends match what's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Are we talking about the right things?
Yeah.
Really important.
So talking of questions then, and the advisor survey, just going into that now, I noticed that if we look at advisor challenges, the business challenges that they're going through, 49% of advisors cited regulation as their main concern. I think that's been an uptick. Is this directly to do with consumer duty, or is there something else lurking in the background?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that's another inherent question on the surveys. What we don't do necessarily is dig really deep. Because actually part of it for me is about then having the debate. We had our annual conference yesterday, and we use the survey almost all the way through the conference, because what it does is it shapes the sessions that we run. But yeah, it's in terms of, sorry, now I've forgotten the question again, because I went off on a tangent. But what were you asking?
Consumer duty, the regulation.
Regulation. Yeah. So we use the survey in all sorts of places, and we don't always dig deep, but regulation, time and time again, comes out as the number one challenge. And I think to answer your question, if you look back to 2023, there was just, I guess it felt like one thing after another, didn't it? Consumer duty, clearly the big one. And as you know, we've got some questions on that. That was, I think, clearly front and centre of people's minds at that point. But also there was a plethora of Dear CEO letters on a whole range of topics. We had SDR coming in right at the end of the year in terms of product labelling. We had the retirement income review, which we're still to see the outcome of that. So I think advisors just felt that there's so much going on. But you're right, it's always number one. But what we've seen is a rise in the scale of where that's at in relation to some of the other challenges and problems. So it's probably no big surprise. And we did debate this actually at the conference yesterday, and that came through that advisors were, it's just there's so much going on that we're trying to cope with in addition to run the business.
Yeah, dealing with cash flow and
all sorts.
find if I just running the business.
Clients. Yeah,
And
yeah,
and with regards to regulation and consumer duty, it's been in the press that the likes of St James's Place have had to change things probably because
yeah,
of the consumer
yeah,
duty. Do you think that's now starting to bite in terms of the reality that this is a piece of regulation that has got some teeth? Because when
yeah.
I did a podcast probably about 6 to 8 months ago, it was a case of it's important. And the people on the podcast were saying it's important, but I sort of felt like, is it going to have the teeth? Is it going to change what it's really wanting to change?
Yeah.
But it sounds like that's starting to happen and maybe feeding down in terms of people taking this more seriously.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. Back to the survey, I'm just checking my numbers here. Back in, so we asked in our May, so our little pulse survey, how advisors were feeling about consumer duty, and to what impact did they think it would have on their business. And to be fair, just checking my numbers, about 39% of them said pretty much very little impact, or no impact at all, right? And what we saw between May, which was pre-implementation date, to November, is a complete turnaround. This was probably one of my aha moments that I talked about earlier, and that suddenly we've seen this complete shift in advisor sentiment towards consumer duty. So we're now seeing that 41% of them are saying, actually, this is having an impact on my business. So I think this is just taking time, isn't it, to work through the system for people to really understand what it means for them, and what they have to think about in terms of that, not just getting to launch, but what's next. Implementation date was fine, we got there, but this is an ongoing process. This is absolutely evolution, not revolution. And I think the survey really, for me, that complete flip really demonstrated that. And then we asked them, the follow-up question. So on this one was, what are you specifically going to focus on in 2024? What's the most important part here? And the key priority was continuing to check their ongoing assessment of value and using client feedback. And I think that's an interesting one, because we're now into the practicalities of, well, how do we measure value and how do we actually ask clients? So I think that old, clients don't leave me, therefore they're getting value is not the answer here. And at Benchmark, actually, we've done a lot of work with the advisors. So we did a really interesting piece of work with Holly Mackay at Boring Money, where we went right out to end consumers and asked them about what do they value from their advisors. And there was 27 different factors, and we boiled that down to 5 key areas. And we've now built a robust questionnaire that can test these factors, and advisors are using that after every client review to measure the sentiment on these factors. So what we've tried to do, because value, we heard all of last year, well, it's really difficult to measure it. It means different things to different people. It's quite intangible. Well, we could argue that, but actually what we're being asked to do is put some rigor and process around that. So what we're now doing is just rolling out from that pilot the questionnaire, where already we're seeing examples of advisors looking back on client feedback and identifying, in the main, clients are happy, that's great, but there's an outlier here. Who is he and why are they saying that? We've got great examples of advisors contacting clients that they thought were happy and being told, well, I'm happy about this, but in these areas I was a bit confused. Often it's actually about back to that client understanding piece. So what advisors are now doing is able to take that feedback on board, and look at it in the context of a number of different factors of consumer duty. So this is just going to take time, isn't it?
I think when you're talking about the perception of value, I think goes back to our previous point about the strength of the questions that you're asking to try and get that
Absolutely.
data to be able to really understand what's important to the client. So and do advisors, is there like do they share best practice? Because sometimes it's almost like there's a little bit of unknown here. So is there a readily available sharing of information in terms of this is what some advisors are doing over here, to give other advisors some kind of guidance in terms of what to do?
I mean, certainly in the network, we have that opportunity, don't we? We engage with advisors on a daily basis. We run quarterly meetings. We're always happy to run webinars, get advisors on board, engage. And also it's about, the people that work within my area who are out meeting advisors day in, day out. If we can share best practice around amongst our own team of the partnership directors and service managers that we have, then when they're out with speaking to their clients, they can talk about good practice that they're seeing. So I think there's a number of different ways that, best practice is being shared. I mean, obviously before I moved, one of the things I had to do was fair value assessments and target market for the investment solutions business for our model portfolios. And again, what I found was the industry were really happy to share best practice. One of the first things I'm sure we all did when the fair value assessments were published was look at what everybody else had done. Well, that's an interesting way of calculating it. That's an interesting way of presenting it. So I think we'll possibly also maybe get to a standardized approach, certainly on fair value assessments for products, similar to what we reached with the assessments of value, slightly different but similar, in the fund industry, because they've had, they were 3 years ahead of the game in this one in terms of having to assess value. So there were some principles certainly here at Schroders we were able to use on the back of the fund assessments, and think about that in the context of how we were then going to use that information for the model portfolios. And I think advisors will be the same. It's how can we come together to share best practice? And it'll also be interesting, won't it, to see what the regulator will do when they start to do some thematic reviews on this, which we would anticipate. Can we get examples of good and poor practice? And there's a lot of engagement, isn't there, with the regulator on all of this. So, we are only in year one, aren't we? So I think the next few years we'll see a refinement of some of this.
Lots to do. And
absolutely.
When you talk about sharing best practice, when you sort of move that conversation into fees and charging, is there a downward pressure to change the fee structure, whether to increase or decrease? Because that's the one thing, if you start talking about fees, it can be quite inflammatory. And that's the one thing you see in the press. It's like, well, you charge that, I wouldn't charge that. But again, sharing that best practice, looking at fees, is the pressure starting to build a little bit?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the survey I thought was quite interesting on this one. Many advisors said that they felt it was an increased pressure on charges. But when you actually looked at what they were charging, particularly if I recall, it was between 0.5 and 0.75, the number of advisors charging at that level had shot up, right? And it was at the expense of those charging up to 0.5% had dropped significantly. So it kind of felt like they're telling me one thing, but the numbers are suggesting something different. So it was suggesting that they felt a pressure, yet the fees had increased. So that was a really interesting debate.
That was my aha moment. That was like okay,
okay. Well, wait a minute. You say one thing and you're doing something, or it feels like something else is happening. And then the other area where we asked under the consumer duty piece was about did they think as a result of consumer duty that the ongoing charging structure was under pressure? And there was quite a number of advisors there. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but they said, yes, we do feel that model is under pressure. And to be fair, if you look at some of the language that's coming out of the regulator, it does feel like that ongoing model is under a bit of pressure. I think at one point, didn't they said that about 90% of clients were put in ongoing fee structures, and they weren't convinced that everybody really required that. So, and I think we'll see new fee models emerging, to be honest, particularly as we start to think about wealth transfer to the next generation, where maybe they're in early accumulation. I'm quite happy to pay subscription models we're seeing coming in. One-off fees has got to be again on the radar. So I think it'll be interesting. But I think the ongoing charging one, advisors were definitely saying to us in the survey, we feel that model is under some threat. I actually think, though, if I could call it, there is a bit of a case for the defence here, to be fair. If you think about some of the challenges that we've had over the last year, particularly in the investment market, if you are charging on a one-off basis, it assumes a client then knows pretty much when they need advice. What we saw, though, was, through some of the investment, ups and downs, you think about COVID, sadly the Russia-Ukraine situation, now the Israel-Gaza, things that have impacted volatility in the market, right? We see advisors absolutely on the front foot with clients, talking to them, holding their hands, and many, making sure that they're staying invested, or even understanding, as the survey showed, the number of people that are struggling with the cost of living crisis and stopping things like pension contributions. Now, clearly, people need if people need an income from somewhere, then there are, you have to look at the portfolio and say, how are we going to create that for you? Now, an advisor that's with you every step of the way and delivering an ongoing service is going to be on top of that, in my view. So I absolutely think that there is a place for ongoing advice. So again, I think that's an interesting one to think through.
It is, and I think we are in constant perpetual crisis at the moment, and I can't see that changing too soon.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult times, and we see that in this survey as well, where we ask clients about how they were feeling about, or how did advisors think their clients were feeling about investments. And we've seen a shift from bullish to bearish over the years, but it's still a challenging time in terms of client sentiment, I think, because they have experienced, haven't they, in the last few years, some extreme bouts of volatility.
Yeah, it's been huge. It's been huge. And I think there's a saying, I can't really paraphrase it, but it's almost like, in good times you need good advice, but in a crisis you need great advice. That's when you really need your advisor to be with you, because this is uncharted. We haven't seen this political or economic turmoil for generations.
Absolutely right, and this year will be absolutely no exception. We've also got an election. We've got a US election. If you think about some figures we were showing yesterday at the conference about the number of government changes and elections globally over this year, it's unbelievable. So we are in a time of significant change.
Yeah.
And that's when you're absolutely right. People want an advisor that they can trust.
Yes.
That helps them understand and navigate some of these challenges. But also we still have the cost of living crisis, where people need access to income. One of the reasons, again, we asked about that in the survey, we started to ask about the cost of living crisis back in, it was May 2022, when it was just beginning to come to the fore. And we said, let's ask advisors if they think clients will have to reshape portfolios. And I think it was something like 63% of advisors said, yes, we think we'll have clients that will have to reshape. Actually, we were then in the great position, because it's our survey, of saying, and have they actually reshaped portfolios? And what's happened is the number of advisors that said clients have had to reshape portfolios is far in excess of those who thought that might happen.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting. But, and clearly the number one reason that they told us in the survey for doing that was, simple, household expenses, fuel bills, all of that stuff that we're all struggling with. But number two has changed. Back earlier in May, it was all about helping wider family. And that's shifted a little bit. Whether they're finished helping the wider family, we're focusing back on ourselves again. But again, that's where an advisor comes in. If you're helping the wider family, let's make sure that that's being done tax efficiently. Back to the value of advice. So the cost of living crisis, is very much at the forefront of many people's minds, but it's where people need good advice in terms of how are we going to manage this. The number of advisors that said people are stopping pension contributions, well, do they really understand the longer term impact of that? And are there other ways of releasing income for them?
I honestly think it's a great time to be a financial advisor, notwithstanding what we've talked about in terms of the cost of regulation and the issues of running a business. People need good advice. It's as simple as that. And you need to have an advisor who's calm, who's considered in their approach, because we are reactionary. I see the volatility and I'm like, right, okay, I can't do that. You need a strong hand say, okay, let's work it through. Let's work it through logically and see where we're going to end up. And it's those conversations which are so important.
They're absolutely right. And time again, back to the work that we did with Borrowing Money, it's back to that trust and peace of mind. I just want to be able to sleep at night knowing somebody's looking after my money. It's so important.
Yeah, it's peace of mind. You've mentioned a few things actually in terms of the advisors helping the wider family. This goes into the sort of wealth transfer.
My favorite topic.
Yeah, and I remember when we did a podcast, I think it was Ian McKenna that mentioned it.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what, he's got a really good point. And then it's one of those things. I've seen it once, and I'm constantly bombarded by wealth transfer. So I read your report, and it was interesting to see that. Again, I think the number was 63% advisors are concerned about the wealth transfer, but don't appear to be doing too much.
Doing anything about it.
So I'm concerned and not doing too much. And again, I'm just interested to know why is that? Why is that? Because from an advisor's point of view, you're looking for a client, aren't you? You're looking about their long term, their longevity, and it's like an advisor. You should be looking at your business in terms of longevity as well.
It's exactly spot on in terms of the reason why we've spent a lot of time talking to advisors about that. So it's also about doing the right thing for families, isn't it? But also for those advisors in particular that are looking for, an exit strategy and succession planning and looking to maybe sell their business. Why would you damage the future valuation of the business by allowing allegedly 70% of people inheriting wealth not to use, or is it 60%, not to use your select against you? It doesn't seem logical for me to allow the assets that you spent a lot of time creating with clients or building up and protecting for it to walk out the door when it hits the next generation. I think the two things I hear all the time is, I don't have a proposition because actually, and maybe this leads into the AI discussion. I need to be able to reduce the cost to serve for these, I hate the term, but lower value clients as they're seen at the moment. But it's about protecting the existing assets. So I don't have a proposition that's scalable, and that targets those people. And you can see that, I think it was about 14% of advisors said they had a proposition, if I can recall. But we don't really see it. The numbers don't stack up in terms of the number of advisors prepared to advise lower value clients. So what we deemed as less than £50,000, it was only 25% of advisors. And also, coupled with that, I don't have a proposition and I won't make a profit from them. Now you can kind of understand the logic, right? But maybe it's about the broader picture. And this is where you kind of hope that technology and maybe some of the regulatory changes in terms of advice guidance boundaries. And I know, we hear from advisors that feels quite complicated, and we're still in early days of that. But surely there must be a way to try and engage that next generation and to try and help here. However, as you probably are aware, the one trick that I still feel significant number of advisors are not picking up on is at this first point of transfer at the moment in the baby boomer generation. I'm going to generalise, is from a husband to a wife, who was typically, and again, I'm generalising, but if you think it through, I always say to people, think about your parents or your grandparents. It's often was a non-earning spouse who was quite frankly not engaged in the conversation. And we know this because they told us, so this is always the don't shoot the messenger moment. We did lots of research. We spoke to lots of women, particularly widows, who had left advisors and said, I just felt that they didn't really understand me. They didn't understand that I had specific needs of my own. The conversation was all around the amount of assets, where it was invested and how it's grown. And she said, I'm sitting there thinking, I actually want to help my kids get on the property ladder. I have a different views on what I think we should be doing with the money. So 70% of these women, leave the family advisor. That's happening now. And we did some research at the back end of last year, which can confirm those numbers. It wasn't quite the 70% number, because that's been banded around the industry, to be fair, for a number of years. But our numbers said that, well over 30% of people, or women, widows, will not use the family advisor. So it matches up. They just wanted a safe space to talk about their view on finances. They felt like lacking in confidence, and that the conversation wasn't really aligned to their requirements.
What do you think the disconnect is, though? As in, what's preventing an advisor from doing that? Because ultimately, it's about looking at needs and wants and aspirations, etc.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I hear lots of reasons, like the husband doesn't want the partner involved in the conversations. I can't understand why. What? So are we saying that at the point of a widow's or of women's most vulnerability, that they should be left not understanding anything about finances? I just don't subscribe to that at all. I think, I mean, interestingly, because we do a lot of sessions on this, and we say the biggest thing is just understanding these women and understanding that they want a different type of conversation. So it's not, and again, actually, a really interesting point, James. Often advisors will say to me, well, is the answer to put a female advisor in my business? Now, there's a big challenge with that. Only 16% of advisors are female, so there's not enough to go around, right? But actually, when we did our own research, 76% of the women that we surveyed said, I don't really care. I don't really care, whether my advisor is male or female. I just want somebody that gets me, that understands what I want to talk about, and engages me in the right way, and somebody that I can trust. But just is, that's right across the industry. That's what everybody is saying in terms of what they want from an advisor. So there's nothing new here. It's just about starting to think about that demographic. And I always say to advisors who do a bit of an audit in your client bank, so where are these baby boomer couples, and ask yourself genuinely, are we engaging that female client? I had the pleasure of speaking at a conference in South Africa last year for Schroders, and I met a couple of advisors. We were talking about the subject, and one of them said, I wished I'd heard you talk 6 months ago. He said, because two of my clients, big clients, they passed away sadly. The money went to widows, and I said I was sacked within a month. And interestingly, often driven by the next generation. Yeah. So my message is, sadly, don't completely ignore the next generation. They often influence what that widow will do.
So the advice is do an audit on your client portfolio, start to engage with the spouse and the next generation.
Yeah.
Because sorry, Joan.
And be genuine, be honest when you're doing the analysis. Because I've got a lot of advice. When I sat down, I thought, what, we don't really. We don't. And many of these women also said, I'm quite happy to engage with the advisor on my own, so that I can have a conversation about my needs and my requirements and how I feel about money.
Because I think, again, the other question I had was related to wealth transfer, and it was the 90% of advisors don't have a different marketing strategy either.
Correct.
So it goes into the concern about it. They don't have a strategy, and they're not engaging, but it's happening. And that story just then about that advisor who's lost his client. I mean, it's preventable.
He said, I was in complete shock. He said, and I've done exactly what I've gone right through my client bank and been really honest about, am I really engaging that wider family? But you're right. And it's a really interesting point. If only 10% have a strategy for engaging and retaining these women, that's a massive threat to the business. But my goodness, what a fantastic opportunity for advisors then to hold themselves out as specialising in women, and particularly widowed and also divorced.
It's market opportunity. It's there.
Hugely. And as one advisor says to me, this is terrible, but she said, the one thing about rich widows is they lunch with others. They hang out together. And he said, I have a constant source of referrals. If you're suddenly seen as an expert in this area, what a great opportunity. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to know that the widows aren't looking for female-only advisors.
No,
because practically it's impossible. Yeah. And running a recruitment business, tell me, I don't see any discrimination. I just see people just need good advisors. So I think that's really interesting to know that research is quite good.
I'm happy to share that research with anybody who wants it. But that was another. Obviously, it was a slightly different survey to our main one, but because I wanted to dig into it in a bit more detail. But I'll be totally honest, that was another aha moment, because advisors had often said when I was presenting about this at conferences, is the answer a female advisor? Well, personally, I don't think so. I have an excellent male advisor. I don't think so, but I don't have any. I don't have any real evidence. But this, at the end of last year, this gave me the evidence that I was looking for.
I think the way sometimes I look at it quite, basically is we need to remove tags. You know, we
Yeah,
need to remove the tags that we all seem to be,
and
whether you're left or
stereotype.
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
people
absolutely.
need good advice. If you've got an advisor who listens to you,
Fundamentally.
works out, can understand what your aims and aspirations, that's all you're looking for.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I think we
absolutely.
tend to get channeled into, oh, it must be this, it must be that. I don't think you need that. You just need good people to do a good job. Let's
Do a
keep
good
it
job.
basic. Yeah.
No, you're right. You're absolutely spot on. Yeah.
So whilst people can still do a good job, that leads me on to AI. We've got a
AI.
couple of
Yeah,
minutes
yeah.
left.
No,
So
that's great. Great.
what,
Love this
yeah,
topic.
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean,
So what's happening? What's the mood music at the moment
well,
with AI?
I think we're in a really interesting space with AI, right? So if we think back to a year ago at Christmas time, it was probably the first time most of us heard of ChatGPT. And we were all playing about with it, thinking, oh, this is amazing. I can ask it questions and it will return a response instantly, and it's quite cool. And I think where we are now is we're now in the year of how do I genuinely implement this in my business and leverage it? So can it drive efficiencies within my business? What can it actually do for me? And I thought what was really interesting in the survey was the number of advisors that now see AI as an opportunity. So 70%, and we've seen quite a sharp increase in that compared to the previous survey. So advisors are sitting back thinking this technology is really interesting. I think it's an opportunity, but I think we're at the point of, but how? What do I do next? I think probably the advice is get some help, because it's not for most of us, it's not our natural skill, is it, in terms of thinking through that. We're seeing some really interesting use cases. I saw some tech the other day that does a very simple review process with a client, particularly back to our conversation on those clients who are in early accumulation. They just need one conversation a year to check that nothing's changed. So I've seen some really interesting technology that has, with a chatbot, which feels very real, to be honest. Just working out whether or not the client has had any significant changes, being able to document that, or whether or not they now need to maybe speak to an advisor. I'm hearing lots of interesting things happening in the actual advice process, in terms of suitability reports, how we prepare for review meetings, how we check client advisor data, sort of client data. I think obviously it comes with words of warnings, doesn't it? Suitability reports or straight into ChatGPT with client data is probably not a good idea. So I think where I'm seeing this working really well is where advisors are getting the right support from businesses who are also skilled in doing this and understand advice and the advice process. There's lots of startups out there, isn't there, in the AI space? But my advice would be to work with somebody who can demonstrate that they've already, engaged with advisor businesses, understand some of this stuff, and can be, really helpful in terms of leveraging efficiency. Which is when we ask advisors, "What do you think AI could do for you?" And that's the key. The key response is about improving efficiency. What it's not about is about reducing jobs. I think what advisors, we had a great advisor speaking about this at our conference recently, and he said, what we've been able to do is actually make people's jobs more interesting. We've taken some of the heavy lifting away from them. We've re-engineered our processes. We're working very closely as well with compliance, as he said, because that, we are regulated businesses. He said, but also we're making a difference to people's jobs. He said, this is not about, cutting jobs. And we saw horrible headlines certainly last year about how AI is going to cut jobs. He said, it's not about that for my business. It's about delivering a better quality of service to clients. We've got more time to spend with them. And also the people that work with me don't spend hours and hours reading stuff that they just, we can manage very quickly and efficiently. So I think we're starting to see some really interesting things emerging here where advisors are starting to implement it in their business. I'm really excited about this and what it can do for us.
Yeah. So I think the survey is saying the next 2 to 5 years is going to be that's where it's really going to lift off. Yeah.
Yeah. And here at Schroders, obviously, we've got a significant amount of activity in terms of how we can use AI to leverage efficiencies within our own business. We all have access to an internal version of OpenAI called Genie, and that's been great. It's allowed however many thousand of us there are globally to just test the technology and think about what are the use cases where we can design kind of processes or implement it to make our jobs more interesting, spend time on the other things. We had a video the other day, Peter Harrison, our group CEO, talking in, I think it was 6 or 7 different languages using a chatbot functionality. It looks like him speaking, as he said himself, I can only speak English. He doesn't speak any foreign languages. As a global business, so we can now have messages going directly from the group CEO in the language of that country. And it did look amazing in terms of how that's being delivered. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities. However, I think advisors are still quite cautious as well, and quite rightly so, in terms of data and it turns out, I don't know how many people listening to this have ever used it, but there are some downsides, and we've got to be very careful, 4-eye check on things. And there was a great story in the press, wasn't there, last week about DPD and I don't know if you read this, about the guy who managed to break the chatbot eventually, and ended up telling him that they were the worst delivery service ever and swearing, which I thought was quite interesting. So there's still some it was a bit of fun when you read it. It wasn't as much fun for DPD. I think they've found the rogue whatever it was that was causing the chatbot to misbehave. So we've still got I think we've got to apply a sense of caution around this. However, I think it should release some massive opportunity, particularly for me, in terms of how can we use this to deliver more access to advice, but in a different way, and actually for a different generation. Right? Any of us who've got teenagers or young people in their 20s in the house will know that they think and act very differently to how we do in terms of interacting with tech.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that goes back to the wealth transfer in terms of, to innovate some products, to use AI, because that's how the genie's out the bottle. We're not going to go back.
Absolutely.
It's just going to go, no, so it's just going to be developed. So, but I think your advice to work with AI firms who understand financial planning is crucial, because there are lots of startups. They need to understand the intricacies of a business that is heavily regulated.
Absolutely.
It's different to running a call center. So there are a few firms out there that I've seen that do specialize in that, but choose your provider. Yeah,
ask for examples, or ask for references, case studies, and I think the good ones will be able to do that now for you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Gillian. I think we've got about 30 seconds left. Any final thoughts? Anything else that you wanted to tell the advisory community?
No, I think we've run around a whole lot of topics, but I think 2024 will still be challenging, but I just think it also brings lots of opportunities, and particularly opportunities around demonstrating the value of advice to clients. So I'll just leave with that one.
Well said. Gillian Hepburn, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.